Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and today I'm joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Thank you so much for joining me on this evening's show, Kieran.
Thanks for having me back, Michael. It's been a while since we've co-hosted, and I've really missed you.
I missed you too, Kieran. I was caught off guard a little bit there. I wasn't even looking at the camera when the show went live, but I am ready. I promise our viewers. We've got a lot to talk about today. We are discussing Gary Lineker blasting the BBC for their coverage of Gaza. The government have announced funding for some geoengineering experiments. Some people are very worried about chemtrails on the internet. I speak to someone who really understands what is being funded here and whether we should be worried or not. We are also going to discuss Elon Musk, who has discovered that tying himself to Donald Trump isn't necessarily a bulletproof business strategy. At least 10 people have been killed in an Israeli attack on Jaffa School in Gaza City. The drone attack sparked a fire which rapidly spread through tents and classrooms housing displaced people. The bodies of the victims, at least one of whom was a child, were burned beyond recognition. 2 survivors were interviewed by Al Jazeera about their experience.
We put our heads on the pillow and heard a boom. We flew and landed on the ground again. Our heads were scratched and blood was dripping from us. We started looking for our young children and running, pulling them as we went. We didn't know where to go. Where should we go? They hit shelters. They hit our houses. They hit us wherever we go. What can we do? Where do we go? You tell us.
No one knew what was happening. All of a sudden, we looked at the school and found it all burning. We were surrounded by the fire. It was a miracle we got out. Those who were caught by the fire died quickly. Women, children, and the elderly got burned. The number of injured is big. The number of martyrs is big.
The Gaza Health Ministry says at least 39 bodies and 105 wounded people have arrived at Gaza Strip hospitals over the past 24 hours. In the early hours of Tuesday morning, Israeli airstrikes targeted bulldozers used for rescuing survivors and recovering bodies from under the rubble.
These 10 bulldozers that were destroyed used to serve Gaza City in the northern governorate of Gaza. They served 300,000 people. These bulldozers removed the rubble. The rubble is still in the streets, and we can't move. People are still trapped under the houses. We don't know where they are taking us. Do you want to drive us out of the Gaza Strip? We do not want to leave. I am one of those whose eye is gone and I'm waiting to leave for treatment. I do not want to leave.
Oh my God, so you've got a report there about them destroying the bulldozers which are used to clear rubble, and just at the end, just everyone you speak to in Gaza, you're speaking to someone about bulldozers, and it just so happens that his eye has been shot out by the Israelis. An artillery attack on Mo El Dora Children's Hospital in Gaza City also caused significant damage to the hospital's intensive care unit, as well as its solar panel system. Solar panels are a vital source of power in Gaza, which has been held under total siege by Israel for the last 52 days. Israel has also ceased claiming that any part of Gaza is a safe zone. Until January, a small alleged humanitarian area was marked on maps that were posted online and dropped from the air by the IDF. Now, of course, Israel did not actually refrain from attacking people within those supposedly safe areas. An investigation by BBC Verify found they were hit by airstrikes at least 97 times between May 2024 and January 2025. But they've dropped the pretense now. So before they said, go to this humanitarian zone, we'll still bomb it, but go there. Now they're saying, well, we admit it, there are not any humanitarian zones. In an interview with the BBC World at One, American orthopedic surgeon Sam Attar described his experience treating predominantly child and women victims of Israeli attacks in Gaza.
The medical needs are immense and overwhelming, and it's just waves of inactivity and silence in the emergency room, followed by waves of multiple people showing up at once that were injured. And sometimes they deliver more dead bodies than there are people to actually treat. When I showed up to the emergency room, there was one child with an open skull fracture. His brain was falling out of his head, and they intubated him. They weren't sure if they should keep him on a ventilator. And the person next to him, she was about 20 years old or so. She was dead. The family was mourning her. And then they brought in another 5-year-old child. He was also dead. So that was our mourning. Didn't really do anything medical. We just helped the staff shroud someone that was killed.
You're talking a lot about children that you're treating. Is that typical that there are children among all your patients?
Yeah, a lot of the wounded have predominantly been women and children that we've been seeing, not just at this hospital, but the other one that I was at previously. The scene that affected me here was that night in the morgue. The girl that had her brain falling out and they thought it just wasn't worth resuscitating her. She was foaming at the mouth and we just watched her gasp for breath, bleeding from her mouth and her nose. And we took her to the morgue, and that's when they showed me all the other bodies and said, this is the father, his head was missing, this is the mother. We found her melted with 3 children. They opened the bag. I didn't ask them to, but it's like they needed to open the bag to prove to me that what they were saying was true. And when they did, one of the workers just started crying.
That was an interview from The World at One yesterday. So on Tuesday, you can still find the whole thing on the internet, on BBC Sounds. I mean, it just sounds like hell on earth, right? And I suppose, the media goes through waves of paying attention to Gaza and not, and it seems like this is just completely continuous, that when you were there, women, children, every time a doctor from Gaza or a doctor who's been in Gaza speaks, they say it's like that, right? Worse than we can even imagine. Of course, as well as continued bombing, Israel has continued its brutal siege on Gaza. All aid has been blocked from entering the enclave, including fuel for generators. That's, of course, now for over 50 days. The UN has said at least 60,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of serious health conditions due to malnutrition as food supplies dwindle under that siege. Now, Gaza's health ministry reported that as of the 1st of April, 32 people, including 28 children, had died of malnutrition and dehydration at hospitals in northern Gaza. In a report published on the 2nd of April, Save the Children confirmed that at least 27 children had been killed by starvation and disease. Now, here's an extract from that report. So they say, in the north, it is estimated that 1 in 3 children under the age of 2 are now suffering from wasting, the most severe form of malnutrition, compared to 1 in 6 children in January. As according to the Global Nutrition Cluster, a group of humanitarian organizations focused on nutrition. Malnourished children urgently need nutritionally rich food, which is easy to consume, such as ready-to-use therapeutic food and therapeutic milk for young children. They also need essential medicines, such as antibiotics, health facilities, and trained healthcare workers who can detect and treat malnutrition. However, with more than 400 attacks on healthcare documented since October, 26 of Gaza's 36 hospitals have been rendered completely non-functional, while entry of medical supplies into Gaza remains restricted. Once severe, acute malnutrition takes hold, children often develop other conditions. The immune system of a severely malnourished child begins to shut down, making otherwise non-life-threatening conditions like diarrhea potentially lethal. Today, the Foreign Minister of France, Germany, and the UK released a statement condemning Israel's aid blockade. Here's some of what that statement said. So they say Israel has now fully blocked the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza for over 50 days. Essential supplies are either no longer available or quickly running out. Palestinian civilians, including 1 million children, face an acute risk of starvation, epidemic disease, and death. This must end. We urge Israel to immediately restart a rapid and unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza in order to meet the needs of all civilians. During the last ceasefire, the UN and INGO system was able to deliver aid at scale. The Israeli decision to block aid from entering Gaza is intolerable. Many of you, of course, will remember Keir Starmer's comments in the early days of Israel's war on Gaza. When asked if it was acceptable for Israel to withhold power and water from the population of Gaza, he said, quote, "I think Israel does have that right." It's also worth noting that today's condemnation hasn't come with any change in UK policy or even threat of change in policy towards Israel. Israeli newspaper Haaretz has published a new investigation on the massacre of 15 Palestinian paramedics and aid workers last month. The piece reveals details from the IDF's internal investigation, which were omitted from the public summary of the investigation and which undermine claims made in that summary. Significantly, it reveals that the IDF investigation found that soldiers fired indiscriminately for 3.5 minutes. The public summary, published on Sunday, explicitly claimed that soldiers did not fire indiscriminately. So you'll remember here the context. Israel sort of denied that they had shot at people who were clearly aid workers. There was footage then that showed that to be a complete lie. These were aid workers who were driving vehicles with their lights on, so they got found out. Israel then did their own investigation and sort of said, oh, there's been a professional error, some mistakes have been made. And Haaretz are now saying that what was in that investigation by the Israelis, surprise, surprise, contained something far short of the whole truth. The Haaretz piece also confirms that the vehicles were travelling on a permitted route which did not require coordination. This contradicts the IDF's justification of the attack on the basis that the vehicles were uncoordinated, meaning their movements had not been approved by the IDF. So lie after lie after lie. Speaking separately to Sky News, senior officials from the UN, Palestinian Red Cross and Civil Defence said coordination was not required because the area had not been declared a combat zone. Israel initially claimed that the vehicles did not have emergency signals on when they were attacked, and that soldiers reasonably assumed they belonged to Hamas militants. Again, this was proven false by footage recovered from the mobile phones of one of the victims. Flashing red lights and ambulance and fire insignia are clearly visible. Moving on to the diplomatic front, Qatari and Egyptian mediators have reportedly proposed a new ceasefire deal. It envisages a truce lasting 5 to 7 years. That's after the release of all Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. Also a formal end to the war and a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Of course, Israel has consistently refused to make military withdrawal from Gaza part of any ceasefire deal, even though it was part of the initial agreement signed by both parties on the 17th of January. Of course, it doesn't seem likely that Israel will face much pressure from the US to change its stance after meeting with senior Republicans at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. Israeli Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, posted the following on X. I had the honor and privilege of meeting with senior Republican Party officials at Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate. They expressed support for my very clear position on how to act in Gaza and that the food and aid depots should be bombed in order to create military and political pressure to bring our hostages home safely. So this is one of the most, part of the far right of Netanyahu's cabinet. Of course, Netanyahu is already far right by most common definitions, but when it comes to Israeli politics, Netanyahu, I suppose, is centre right, and Ben-Gvir is far right, and he is now saying that he's gone to Mar-a-Lago. And not only have they all agreed that the siege is a good idea, they've said, and we should proactively go and bomb food depots to put even more pressure by starving and doing collective punishment. In case you sort of thought maybe he's just sort of spinning this, maybe they didn't actually agree to that, maybe this is sort of the Israelis trying to pretend that the Americans agree with them more than they actually do. Well, this was Trump himself posting on Truth Social. I've just spoken to the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, relative to numerous subjects, including train, Iran, etc. The call went very well. We are on the same side of every issue. We are on the same side of every issue. So that is basically saying he has my unconditional support to do everything that he is doing. Kieran, there is a sort of, I suppose, Groundhog Day element sometimes to reports like these, because you've got the hellish situation on the ground in Gaza. You've got Israeli forces lying about it. Then you've got some sort of tough but somewhat mealy-mouthed words from countries such as the UK and France, who then don't follow through on anything that would actually change Israel's behavior. And then you've got the Americans saying, actually, you know what? This is all great.
Yeah. Michael, you mentioned the media attention going away, coming back, and everything being the same. And I feel, you mentioned Groundhog Day, I feel like I'm, as I'm sure many people do, living through the most horrific version of Groundhog Day imaginable. And I think the challenge for us, as much as anything else, by us, I mean people not being bombed, not being shot, not being starved. The challenge for us, as much as anything else, is almost a linguistic challenge, which is to say, a challenge to constantly find new ways to express the horrors that we're witnessing, to find a new vocabulary that keeps pace with the pace and imagination of Israeli evil. There's no other way of putting it. And we know that, I mean, that's part of Israel's strategy, right? It's part A, hope that people get so bored that their attention migrates. Well, that largely hasn't happened. Part B, even if propaganda doesn't work and non-Palestinian civil society becomes enlightened to the horrors unfolding in Gaza, hope that people reach a kind of saturation point such that they develop a kind of reflexive aversion to having to deal with psychologically what's happening in Gaza. Hospitals, schools, food depots, aid tents, journalists. It's a record of genocide. I mean, this is the nitty-gritty, the kind of granular record of a genocide. And the British, French, German statements are worth less than zero. They're worse than nothing. They're a kind of strategic cognitive dissonance, right? On the one hand, in rhetoric, throw out the odd mealy-mouthed criticism of the state of Israel. In actuality, spare no expense trading with them weapons, whatever else it is that they require to exterminate Palestinians in Gaza and, in a more slow motion fashion, ethnically cleanse the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And I just want to say very briefly about the end game in all of this from the Israeli point of view, because I think it's kind of intuitive or obvious when you say it, but actually it doesn't get very much airtime at this point. When Israel declared itself independent in 1948, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, the lines that they formed, they didn't form there because the state of Israel said, here's our state, lads, let them have that territory. That's it, we've conquered enough. Here's our territory, let them have theirs. They formed there because they were repulsed by other Arab armies and an admittedly very fragmented Palestinian resistance, and they were forced into a standstill. And for many Israelis over the past 80 years, particularly in the political class and the military class, that's unfinished business. That's been unfinished business. And I think what we're seeing, and over time you've seen fits and starts in terms of the ultimate goal of colonizing that territory. And, Israel's gone through various waves, political cycles. Sometimes it's a bit more keen on lending credence to rhetorically the two-state solution, and sometimes it's more open and predatory. And at the moment, I think conditions have aligned in a very propitious way for the state of Israel. You've got Trump in the White House and obviously various other things going on, which means that kind of endgame and that kind of unfinished business with the Gaza Strip and with the West Bank is, I think, being sped up. So this is a long way of saying the only way this stops is with us, is with Palestinians, and is with international civil society putting pressure that goes beyond, although they're brilliant, protests and so on. It's about translating that into economic resistance, etc., because it ain't coming from within Israeli society, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't coming from within Israeli society. I mean, that's why I think it's ridiculous for anyone to sort of be opposed to BDS and sort of say, I don't like what the Israelis are doing, but I'm not in favor of anything that could be divisive. Right? Well, if someone had said that to you about apartheid South Africa back in the 80s, they'd said, oh no, I don't like apartheid, but I don't think we should boycott them or I mean, kicking them out of sports competitions. That would be incredibly extreme, wouldn't it? Very divisive. That'd be punishing people who don't have much to do with it. Well, if you want this thing to stop and there's no interest within that society for this thing to stop, then the pressure is going to have to come from the outside. I'm going to move on to two British MPs who have just returned from the West Bank. They are the independent MP Shawkat Adam and the Lib Dem Andrew George. Now, unlike the two Labour MPs who were recently deported from Israel, Adam and George were allowed to enter the West Bank, but they were still confronted by armed security forces and armed settlers. My colleague Richard Hames today spoke to both after they gave a press conference in Parliament. This is Shawkat Adam.
It happened all so quickly, so we were just witnessing settlers grazing their cows, and then the sheep came along on a land that didn't belong to them. So whilst a Palestinian was showing us this, a police car with two armed police officers came to us jumped out and pointed their guns at us and asked us what we were doing there in Hebrew. It was then when our guide told them that we were British parliamentarians, they lowered their guns. But then an Israeli settler came and he was carrying a gun and pointing in our direction as well. So even though the guns were down, the fingers were on the trigger, and it was all very, very tense. But what was surprising is the settlers, the Palestinians themselves, seemed to accept this as an everyday occurrence.
You're a parliamentarian. Tell us about the next stage of parliamentary strategy. What should Keir Starmer's Labour Party be doing now that it's in government? And what can you do in order to support that, perhaps along with the Independent Alliance and other MPs?
So it's not about taking sides, it's about doing the right thing. And we must be consistent when we want to talk about justice and freedom, etc. So we will continue highlighting the issues in every shape and form that we can, whether it's written, oral, debates, any question that we can do. The Labour government should do what it should have done as soon as it came into power. It must impose economic sanctions and military sanctions straight away. And it's not time for words anymore. We need stronger actions.
There's been much criticism of the idea of a two-state solution, that it's inadequate in some ways. What are your views on this?
I think, it's very difficult. I think that's something that Palestinians must decide for themselves. For me, there were moments in despair where I felt it's gone beyond that now. I don't know how that physically would look like with the demarcation of the whole territory and the disenfranchisement of the people. So I can understand why people would say that.
You rejected the term settlers. Why is that an inadequate description of what's happening?
A settler is something that Snow does, on a gentle winter morning. These people are not settling anywhere. They're aggressive. They're colonizing. What is happening in Gaza is an absolute tragedy. But what is happening in the West Bank is no less. And it's going in the direction of what's happening in Gaza. It's going to take one response from a Palestinian who is living his life on the edge that is going to cause a catalogue and a domino effect which will be catastrophic for the whole region.
So that was independent MP Shokat Adam. The MP he went with is the Lib Dem Andrew George.
We've got a government whose part is rather scared of its own shadow as far as Israeli and Palestinian politics is concerned, because they have the shadow of accusations of anti-Semitism kind of hanging over them, and also the concern that they may upset their relationship with the new Trump administration as well. So I think with those two factors, I think into play, I think that's causing them to kind of sit on the fence where people like Shokat and I are very keen to push them off and to actually try and advance those issues and to bring in sanctions and to recognise rights more than they are. It seems to me that you have a Netanyahu far-right government with a prime minister who is clinging on to power because he knows that he will face certain legal and criminal sanctions when and if he loses power, and therefore putting off any kind of general election to the last possible moment late next year seems to be the only prospect. And if we get political change there, a more fertile environment in which to have negotiations with a new Israeli government, one hopes that might be the case, but it would also help, I think, if the UK government actually set a standard. I mean, we have legacy in that area. And I think that we should be taking, a more assertive line than we have been.
Does that mean boycotting Israel?
I think it certainly means sanctions against, for example, the illegal settlements. We shouldn't be trading with them. I think sanctions against Smotrich and other right-wing extremist members of the government. Yeah.
And an arms embargo?
In my view, there should be an absolute arms embargo. Stopping of all arms licenses.
I mean, an arms embargo should be the absolute minimum. Obviously, the Labour Party haven't gone for it. He's a Lib Dem backbencher. I'm not actually sure what sort of the position of the Lib Dem frontbench is. Let's go on to another sort of element of sort of British reaction to what's going on in Gaza. So last week, you'll know, because we covered it here, a letter condemning Israel's actions in Gaza and calling for a ceasefire was signed by 36 members of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and it was published in the Financial Times. There's an update on that story because now all 36 signatories are now subject to a complaints procedure. So one Harriet Holdenberg has been suspended as vice chair of the board's internal division and asked to step back from her role on the executive pending the investigation. An official statement by the Board of Deputies said the letter, which said, quote, "Silence is seen as support for policies and actions that run contrary to our Jewish values, does not accurately represent the position of the organisation." So, I mean, we know it doesn't represent the position of the organisation because the Board of Deputies have throughout this conflict been basically attacking anyone who wants to hold Israel to account. And, I mean, it has in its constitution that it wants to sort of defend Israel. They say, well, it doesn't mean we like Netanyahu. But now you've got this, I think it's 1 in 8 members of the Board of Deputies put out something saying, look, we are Zionists. We believe in the state of Israel, but we have to speak out against what this government is doing and what this government is doing to the people of Palestine. And instead of the Board of Deputies saying, okay, there's disagreement within our ranks, they've decided to discipline them, which I think is shocking. I don't know what other word there is for it. Obviously, this is the organisation which, I mean, remember all those headlines about Board of Deputies criticise the Labour Party. Obviously, the Labour Party must be completely rotten because the Board of Deputies are criticising them. The Board of Deputies are now disciplining anyone who expresses any concern about what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. Elon Musk tying his fortunes to those of Donald Trump might not have been a great business move. Amid consumer boycotts of the company, sales for Tesla are down 20% compared to last year, and profits at the company are down a pretty massive 71%. That's led Musk to tell investors he will reduce his role heading the so-called US Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. He made the announcement in an earnings call to Tesla investors. CNN had the audio.
There's been some blowback for the time that I've been spending in government with the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. There are some challenges. And I expect that this year will be, there'll probably be some unexpected bumps this year. I'll continue to spend, a day or two per week on government matters for as long as the president would like me to do so.
So he's taking a step back. He still will be. I think he sort of suggested he'd be working with the president for 2 days a week. There's actually a limit to how long he is allowed to be working for the president because he wasn't confirmed by Congress. He's not an official member of the administration. So there's some technicalities there. But anyway, Elon Musk seems to want to distance himself from Donald Trump because it's been damaging to his business interests. That wasn't always the case. So the share price of Tesla since Elon Musk joined the Trump administration tells a very interesting story. So you can see here, initially, when Musk was selected for the DOGE role, Tesla shares rocketed. And actually what you can see is as soon as sort of Donald Trump was elected, Tesla shares rocketed. And that's because people thought, well, Elon Musk has someone in the administration who can give Tesla or do favors for Tesla. And that's still the case. There is still an administration that will do favors for Tesla. The reason it falls is because people have realized, well, even if the administration can do favors for Elon Musk, it's so incompetent that even sort of corruption plus incompetence is not necessarily more valuable than no corruption and competence, right? So actually people maybe preferred Tesla shares under Biden than they do under Donald Trump, even though Musk is on the inside now, but that's because Trump is so incompetent that it's not clear that that's going to work out in the interests of the company. I think also the trade war has something to do with the decline of that share price because lots of Tesla parts are manufactured in China. Kieran, I suppose there's sort of a number of elements here where it seems like the only thing that can discipline Trump and his coterie, like it's not the media, it's not the Republican Party, I mean, it's not the Democrat Party who don't really know what to do with themselves. It's really only the markets. It's a bit depressing because obviously the only thing that made him U-turn on his trade war was people selling off treasuries. So sort of the bond markets turning against him. Elon Musk now potentially moving away from Doge. Again, that wasn't because of any sort of liberal opposition. It was because people who own Tesla shares got the heebie-jeebies. What can we make of this? Should we be celebrating it anyway?
God bless the free market, comrade free market. No, it's more complicated than that. I think one of the, just to say briefly on Musk's character development arc, one of the, I suppose, advantages of Trump's bonkers temperament, and by extension, Trumpism's bonkers temperament, is that there's a kind of sped up cycle of poetic justice, if not outright, if not actual justice. So you have Elon Musk spending the last part of last year, the end part of last year, and the inauguration in January, skipping around like a lamb in a meadow. And in March, you see him from March onwards crying on TV. And there's almost I have to fight the urge to almost find it touching somebody who's so wrapped up in themselves. It's almost like a scientific experiment. Somebody who's so wrapped up in themselves that they can't understand why people would be happy that someone who ran around on a stage with a chainsaw celebrating the destruction of tens of thousands or thousands of people's jobs, that person, when they themselves take a bit of a hit, why the general public wouldn't be finding Schadenfreude or glee in that. Somebody who finds that so disturbing that they cry on TV. Yeah, I struggle not to almost find that a bit touching, which is a ridiculous thing to admit. Yeah, and your point about the markets. Well, I think it shows that fundamentally it shows that Trump's way of doing capitalism is still a way of doing capitalism, but it's a risky way of doing capitalism. And obviously, in this country, we saw something similar with Liz Truss, and the markets rounded on her, and obviously that cost her premiership. In Trump's case, he obviously had to climb down on the tariffs front. And I think there's a kind of conflict there between Trump's performative isolationism and like throwing red meat to his base, which he claims is a kind of industrial base to an extent anyway, as well as being, a mixed constituency with I won't say Bible bashers, people from the Bible Belt, etc., etc. But the kind of industrial heartlands, the Rust Belt, as they call it, constituency, to the extent that it exists for Trump, and to the extent that he wanted to be seen to be throwing red meat to them, I think there's an inherent contradiction between that and actually delivering the kinds of policies that make life better for people in the Rust Belt. And I don't think Trumpism is at all ideologically committed to that. So I think you get this kind of strange, chaotic, this kind of schismatic, chaotic form of capitalism, which sort of changes from day to day, and upon which the likes of you and I, Michael, have to kind of project a sort of chaos theory to try and understand. So should we be thankful to the markets? I don't think so. I think that would be taking it a little bit too far. Is it evidence that Trumpism is a sort of mongrel form of capitalism that's ever evolving, and the markets like some of it and dislike other parts of it? Yes.
Yeah, I agree. Come on, let's go through some other Musk news very briefly. Everyone has long suspected it, but the New York Times has now what looks like concrete evidence that the world's richest man suppresses posts on X, the platform he, of course, owns, when he doesn't like what they say. So this is the headline from the New York Times. They criticized Musk on X, then their reach collapsed. And this is from that New York Times article. The New York Times found 3 users on X who feuded with Mr. Musk in December, only to see their reach on the social platform practically vanish overnight. The accounts are the starkest signs yet that Mr. Musk or others at the company had the power to punish critics and that they may be willing to use it, startling free speech advocates who hope that the billionaire would be their champion. One of the accounts is someone called Anastasia Maria Lupis. So the NYT, I haven't come across her before, but I'm going with what they say. They describe her as posting far-right commentary, conspiracy theories, and anti-Semitic statements. Of course, that's the kind of content that usually does very well on Twitter these days or on X. And she had been averaging hundreds of thousands of views per day. But in December, this poster criticized Elon Musk over his support for high-skilled visas to the United States. And this happened. So you can see overnight, she goes from hundreds of thousands of views to barely thousands. So very quickly, not subtle. The NYT also shows a similar thing happened to the far-right influencer Laura Loomer. She also criticized Musk for his support for high-skilled visas, and her views collapsed overnight. They've somewhat recovered. I don't know if that means that Musk has forgiven her or if something else is going on. The same thing happened to a host of the far-right outlet InfoWars. So here you can see that suddenly after a feud with Musk, it collapses. The practice of shadow banning people who criticize Elon Musk would not be completely in line with what he said when he first bought the platform. So this is from that NYT article again. Before Mr. Musk bought Twitter in 2022, when it was known as Twitter, many right-wing users had criticized the company for shadow banning. Mr. Musk wrote in November last year that there is no shadow banning anymore. At the same time, he has said that he believes in freedom of speech, not freedom of reach, meaning that the platform would not bar people for hateful content, but would make it harder to find such content. There will always be critics, Mr. Musk wrote in February last year. What is perhaps notable is that I don't attempt to silence them, even on a platform that I own. Well, those graphs would show otherwise. Again, we've got another situation where I don't really sympathize with either here. I'm not a big fan of the bond markets or Donald Trump, and I'm definitely not a fan of Elon Musk or Laura Loomer. But this does demonstrate, if you needed any more evidence, why letting the world's richest man buy essentially our public square, or what was our public square when it comes to sort of political discourse, buying that and making it subject to his own whims is something that probably a rational society would not do. UK scientists are set to launch outdoor geoengineering experiments as part of a £50 million government-funded programme. The experiments will be small scale, but according to the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, or ARIA, they will provide critical data needed to assess whether technologies to directly cool the climate could actually work. The announcements about the experiments have been greeted with concern by some. So the Daily Mail has this story. So they say here, experiments to dim the sun in bid to curb global warming will be approved by the UK government within weeks. The headline, very reasonable. The story starts with this, though, which is potentially a little bit more alarmist. There's nothing quite like going for a walk on a bright spring day, but basking in the sunshine could soon be a thing of the past. That's because it has emerged that experts are planning on dimming the sun in a bid to curb global warming. So are the government really spending £50 million so that we can never have a sunny day again? I'll find out in one moment. First of all, some on X are also taking this as confirmation that the chemtrails conspiracy was real. So an account called Concerned Citizen, you might think, why am I showing you this? Well, it has almost 1 million followers on Twitter, this account. And when they've posted, the UK government has officially now funded chemtrails. Conspiracy theorists are now up 93 to 0. I'm not sure what the 93 is a reference to, but they're saying this is another conspiracy theory which has been confirmed. Now, of course, it is not just conspiracy theorists who are concerned about geoengineering. The German Environment Agency has recently come out against it. So they released a report last week that concluded this. The use and technical deployment of solar radiation modification, SRM, is to be rejected. SRM can neither preserve the current climate nor restore the pre-industrial climate. Instead, it would create an unpredictable new global climate with significant regional impacts. Interestingly, the German Environment Agency doesn't just come out against deployment of geoengineering techniques, but also wants to stop field experiments. Now, presumably, I imagine that would include the type being funded by the UK this week. To find out more details on this, I'm joined now by someone who presumably thinks these experiments are a good idea. Pete Irvine is Research Assistant Professor at the University of Chicago's Climate Systems in Engineering initiative, focusing on sunlight reflection methods. Thanks so much for joining us on the show. We have discussed geoengineering on this show before, but now that I've got an expert in it, can you sort of lay out for our audience what is being discussed here?
Yeah, so the term geoengineering covers two broad classes of ideas. There's ideas to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that maybe you've discussed before, carbon dioxide removal. And then there's what we're talking about here, which is solar geoengineering, ideas to increase the amount of sunlight that the Earth reflects. Now, as opposed to what the Daily Mail said, we wouldn't see an end of spring days. To offset 1 Celsius of global warming, which is a lot of global warming, would only require a 1% reduction in sunlight. And there's a few different ideas that could achieve this. The one we're most sure about is also the one that could have the biggest effect, and this is stratospheric aerosol injection. This would mimic the cooling effects of major volcanic eruptions. These add a layer of tiny reflective particles into the upper atmosphere. They would reflect light, and the planet would cool. There's a whole host of other ideas that sort of are decreasingly less plausible or have a work at a smaller scale. But the next other most serious one is marine cloud brightening. This is an idea that the clouds over the oceans have been brightened by pollution and could be brightened instead by sea salt. So you could make clouds over the oceans more reflective, and that would also cool the planet.
Which ones of these are being funded here? So the UK is sort of putting some money towards a few experiments. What kind of experiments are we looking at?
Well, the experiments haven't been announced. So the list of the projects that'll be funded is going to be announced in a couple of weeks, I think. But they're looking at a range of ideas, not just these large ones. I think they're also looking at a range of smaller scale ideas that wouldn't have the same global impact.
And I mean, you're someone who's interested in solar radiation management, so I presume you're in favour of this. Why though is there such a difference? So obviously the German Environment Agency is saying not only is solar radiation management a bad idea, but we shouldn't do any experiments in solar radiation management. That would be, they think it's so sort of risky that not only should we not deploy it, we shouldn't even really look further into it. The UK seems to be in a very different place. Is this sort of the most divisive issue in climate science at the moment?
I think that's fair to say, yes. But I think it's worth separating, though. There's two big kinds of risks with these ideas. One is the physical side of things. These efforts to change the climate might reduce many of the risks of climate change, but they would come with side effects and shortcomings. So there's sort of physical risks to consider. And then I think what motivates more people are the kind of political risks. What if this undermined emissions cuts? What if it led to international conflict? So it's worth sort of separating those two. I think it's quite easy to reach very different conclusions about the wisdom of these ideas based on your perceptions of either of those kinds of risks.
And so even the people sort of in favour of this kind of thing, and I'm very much in favour of researching it. I put my cards on the table. I've sort of discussed this on the show before. But even the people who are in favour of researching it sort of say, well, we don't want to deploy it because we don't know it's going to work. We want to do the experiments to see if it will work. At what point, for you as a researcher, when would you look at an experiment and look at the results and say, this does seem to be working? Because I suppose for me, a small-scale experiment where you sort of put some sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere, I struggle to understand how you can test this without sort of doing it on a much larger scale than a small-scale experiment. Well, how does that work?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the way I think about it is, if you want to test how the climate responds, you've got to change the climate. So there's no way to test the climate response except in the virtual world of our climate models, which is where we predict the future of climate change. The same tools would be used there. What these experiments are about, that they're proposing, is to develop our understanding of the small-scale processes that would shape the response. So the marine cloud brightening one is one of the key ones where it probably works. There's something there, but we're not really sure about the dynamic. So, people are working on sprayers to spray out sea salt. Would the particles be the right size? And if they reach the clouds, will the clouds change in the ways we expect or not? So that's what these kind of field experiments might develop, is a better understanding of the processes that we can then represent in our models to predict the broader consequences. So no, there's no way to test it in that large sense. But I mean, for the stratospheric aerosol injection idea, in a way, there's no need to test it because we know that those particles would form, they would reflect light, and by reflecting sunlight, you would cool the planet. Exactly how that would pan out is hard to say, but that's why we also study these things in climate models.
Okay, so sort of the outside experiments is almost so that you can make the climate models a bit more accurate, because then you can sort of plug that into the model to see what the large scale sort of result could possibly be. Obviously, a big worry people have about this is who would do it, who would deploy it, who would have control over this. Termination shock is something that often comes up when sort of discussing geoengineering, because obviously if you are doing this method which needs to constantly be renewed, you need to constantly have, I suppose, planes up in the stratosphere pumping out sulfur if that's the method you go for. If there's some geopolitical event back on Earth which means they stop doing it, then you've got all of this built up climate change that could cause something really dramatically problematic. I mean, I understand you probably work more on the physics side than the politics side of this, but what can you tell us about why we shouldn't be terrified about sort of the geopolitical implications of this?
I'm not telling you shouldn't be terrified of the geopolitical consequence of this. There is good reason to be concerned about this. For me, the question is, should we be more concerned about the geopolitical and other consequences of climate change? And I think that's why these field experiments will develop some technical part of our understanding, but there's a much broader set of work to be done to think through carefully the physical risks and also the social political risks. So yeah, there's a lot more to be done here. I mean, I think the field experiments attract a lot of attention. They're quite controversial, but they're only a small part of what we need to do to understand these ideas.
Often sort of on topics like this, when there are big disagreements, this happened with COVID as well, actually, with sort of the differences between the United States and the UK when it comes to vaccinating kids or whatever. I'm always very interested in why different governments come to different conclusions, dramatically different conclusions. So the UK has obviously come to this conclusion that not only sort of should we look into geoengineering, but we should sort of fund it with taxpayers' money. The Germans have said, absolutely, we shouldn't do this. We should ban it. Is this just sort of who happens to work in those departments at any particular time? Or is there sort of something broader we can say about why a country like the UK might be interested in this and a country like Germany isn't?
And I'd add to that. I mean, I think on one end, you've got some parts of the environmental left are quite against even considering this idea. But also you're seeing on the right. I mean, we've been tracking bans. There's bans on solar geoengineering across 32 states, or proposals, sorry, to ban solar geoengineering, weather control, cloud seeding, and it's implied chemtrails across much of the states. They've not only one has been passed into law, but it's happening. There's resistance to this idea on both sides of the political spectrum. It's partly a matter of personalities. This is still a very small field. I mean, I've been working at 15 years and it was quite a bit smaller when I started, but it's still bubbling up and it's at a small scale. And I think it's worth stressing, the UK is about to put 67 million odd into this topic. ARIA's doing some, but there's also some climate modeling work. That's still only about a fifth of the annual budget of the Met Office, and that's over 5 years. So it's 4% of what the Met Office is going to spend over the same period. So it's a small fraction of climate research. But yeah, it's a controversial idea. And I think, personally, I think we need to move towards quantitative assessments of the science rather than qualitative descriptions of what we should think about it. And on top of that scientific assessment, we need to have a broader discussion. That's part of why I set up the organization that I co-founded, srm360.org. We're trying to synthesize the science on this, as well as hearing from different experts about why they're worried about the geopolitical risks, how we might address them. Yeah, it's a challenging topic, but I think we need a scientific basis on which to judge it.
At the end of this football season, Gary Lineker will stand down from his role as host of BBC Match of the Day. And in an interview with the BBC, he criticised their coverage of Israel.
You could be partial. I know where I stand on this. I'm sorry, it's more important than what the BBC, what's going on there is, the mass murder of thousands of children is probably something that we should have a little opinion on.
But the BBC as a whole needs to be impartial about it.
Why? It needs to be factual.
It needs to be impartial about a conflict, doesn't it? And it's hard.
Does it have to be? It wasn't impartial about Ukraine and Russia.
And you might say that
Why does it have to be impartial about... I understand if it's partial about our government and things in this country and everything like that. But something that's going on that far away, why does it...
Because the Israeli position is that what is happening in Gaza, and by the way, I'm not here as an advocate of the Israeli government, but the Israeli position is that what is happening in Gaza is a response to the slaughter and capture of innocent Israelis on October the 7th. And
which was awful, which was truly awful.
And that full context needs to be there when discussing what's going on.
But that's not the full context, is it? Because the full context starts way before October the 7th.
The full context starts way before October the 7th. So it's interesting that it was the football commentator or the presenter of football shows who says that to Amol Rajan, who hosts, the BBC's flagship politics show, the Today programme, right? And it's Gary Lineker who sort of has the context that really matters, that this didn't start on October the 7th. Also, I think that reference to Russia, sort of fantastic, because when it comes to Russia-Ukraine, the BBC's not remotely impartial. I'm not saying they necessarily should be impartial, right? But the way they reported on Russia invading Ukraine was that it was an outrage. And they never take what Russia says seriously. And I think that's, in terms of sort of concerns about NATO expansion, etc., I think maybe we should listen to what Russia say because it's important to understand people's motivations, not necessarily to take them as a given. But when Russia says, it wasn't us that did the bombing, it was the Ukrainians, right? The BBC doesn't report that as just another opinion, right? They say that, of course, the Russians would say this because they're liars. right? That's not how they speak about Israel. So really well put by Gary Lineker. I think very difficult to disagree with. Speaking of the Today program, another journalist who's just given up a high-profile BBC job is Michelle Hussein. She was a main host of the Today program until leaving for Bloomberg last year. She's also given an interview where she mentions the BBC's coverage of Israel. So she's speaking to Vogue, and she was more diplomatic than Gary Lineker, but not wholly uncritical of her former employers. So she says the lack of access to Gaza is a media strategy that has fundamentally affected reporting of Palestinian civilian life. There is a humanitarian crisis that is ongoing, which covers thousands of children, women, and civilian men who have not only been killed, but maimed and bereaved in ways that you and I, anyone living a life in comfortable circumstances, can't even imagine. This is a media strategy that has meant that the life of the Palestinian civilian is in no way covered in the same way as an Israeli civilian, and both deserve to have their stories told. On whether she felt constrained at the BBC, she said this: "There wasn't anything I couldn't say and there wasn't a question I couldn't ask, but I think all international media is completely hamstrung in its coverage of this conflict, and I think all international and media organizations have done this. There should be formal protests about this lack of access because its implications and its actual effects are so far-reaching. It interferes and obstructs all the normal process of news gathering and reporting, even in a war zone. The fact that it's continued for so long is unprecedented." Kieran there, two very interesting sort of perspectives on the BBC from insiders. Gary Lineker a bit more forthright than Michelle Hussein. I think Michelle Hussein's sort of criticism is still very interesting because, she's kind of saying the reason why coverage is like it is, why it takes Israeli civilian life more seriously than it does Palestinian civilian life, is because journalists aren't allowed into Gaza. But I definitely think there was sort of an implicit criticism that the BBC should be highlighting that much more, and it should be protesting about that much more, because I think what happens is the BBC uses their lack of access to Gaza as an excuse for not covering issues, but you don't actually hear them highlighting the fact that they can't go in there that often.
No, you don't. And, my instinctive, I don't work for the BBC, but I've spent no time at the BBC, but my instinctive view is much more closely aligned with Gary Lineker's, or what I think he's suggesting or alluding to anyway. I think an obvious thing to point out, you can't be impartial unless you're being factual. I mean, it seems to me, unless I'm missing something, being factual is the key ingredient of impartiality. Because without it, you are by definition, if you're not being factual, you're by definition being partial. You're cherry picking facts, right? So that's the first thing. But look, the BBC has been gaslighting Palestinians for decades, whether it's both siding ineffective Hamas rockets and the wholesale slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza and beyond, whether it's killing off Palestinians in the passive voice. So, 25 killed in airstrikes. It doesn't say that they're Israeli airstrikes. Whether it's failing to mention that a Palestinian won an Oscar in their Oscar nights coverage. Or for me, I think the most egregious example, whether it's not giving due depth of coverage to the ICJ and the plausible genocide provisional finding and the ICC's arrest warrants for Israel's prime minister and defense minister, no less. The BBC has been doing this for a very, very long time. Its news arm, and I want to make that distinction, has been, through these examples and many others, I think utterly corrupted by Israeli influence over a very long period of time. And so to have Gary Lineker, somebody who's worked at the BBC, been like maybe the preeminent star at the BBC for a quarter of a century, ex-footballer, working class guy, working class origins at least. And this is why they're going after him, of course. He's not supposed to say things like this. He's supposed to collect his money, say thank you very much, be politically vacuous, and then bugger off into the sunset. But I think to have Gary Lineker, somebody who knows whereof they speak, saying things like this, as much as anything else, will be a tremendous relief to Palestinians who, as I say, feel very gaslit and almost airbrushed out of their own kind of existential suffering.
He's very much just like an ordinary guy with a conscience, right? Which is, I think, why his voice is so powerful, because it's very difficult to sort of say he's this dogmatic, ideological person. Like he's a smart, engaging, charismatic guy who was a great footballer and can kind of tell right from wrong. For better or worse, no one can shape the political weather right now more than Joe Rogan. And his recent interview with Douglas Murray was no exception. You might remember we showed you this clip of Murray at the time in conversation with comedian Dave Smith.
Have you been to the crossing points?
No.
When were you last there at all?
I've never been.
You've never been? I have a journalistic rule of trying never to talk about a country even in passing unless I've at least been there.
Okay.
It's a sort of normal, it's a normal thing to do.
When we analysed that intervention, we pointed out, well, at least two problems with Douglas Murray's argument. So one, you can't go to Gaza right now. You can only go to Israel, and then Israeli military might take you into Gaza for a little brief foray, showing you the things they want to show you. Second, Douglas Murray, in fact, talks about all sorts of countries he's never been to. We won't sort of re-litigate all of that, though. Let's look at Joe Rogan, who has since then hit back.
Have you been there?
Right, that's a good point.
You haven't been?
By the way, how is he in all these wars? Can I just go to wars? By the way, how are you allowed to just go to wars? Is that the way
you should at least
can you just
have the
go
courtesy of going there?
Can I just go to wars, or do I have to come back and say what people want me to say about the wars? Can I go to the wars and have my own opinions, or do I have to have the opinions?
Not if you want to go back.
That's right. It's very interesting, this war tourism. How do I get on this war tourism?
Yeah.
I'd like to go to the Ukraine. I want to go. I want to go. I want to go to all this war tourism.
Do you have any awards that they can melt down and make bullets out of?
Joe, think about this. Do I seem like a guy that has a lot of awards?
Didn't you get one of those YouTube plaques when you hit 100,000?
I don't even know where they send it. I don't know where they're sending those YouTube plaques.
We've got a few of those.
But I like this idea of war tourism. I like the idea of going to a war and then coming back having a very black and white view.
Yes, I've been there.
I get it, and I know, and interesting. Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I love that.
You feel better than the other people.
Well, of course, there's a lot of people. It gets very murky. Most people I know that have been to war have a very murky, complex view of things. But it is good to go to a war and then come back and be as sure as you were before you came.
And you don't have to go for very long.
No, you go for an hour.
Couple hours.
It's a lunch.
Yeah.
It's lunch on the front line.
Put on a flak jacket that says press.
Tea on the front lines, and then you come back and you have all the talking. Yeah.
Joe Rogan does a very good posh English accent. Kieran, was that satisfying to watch?
Yeah, incredibly so. I mean, look, Murray, obviously, I think the phrase is jumped for shark, so he's now a punchline. The fact that it's coming from the right is what's interesting, right? It's obviously key. If we were doing that on this show, whatever, who cares? But the fact it's coming from the right is significant. And I think it's significant because it points to a schism within the right around Israel. So I don't want to overdo it. I'm not saying more of the right is now anti-Israel than it is pro-Israel. But it definitely represents a schism around Israel. And I think especially the kind of so-called libertarian right of Joe Rogan, and I think Dave Smith was the other guy. Sorry if I'm wrong, that they're beginning to, or maybe they have been for a while, but they're beginning to more widely express skepticism towards Israel, educated skepticism towards Israel. And many of them are seeing it, I think, as a kind of extension of their kind of skepticism to the American military-industrial complex. And so I think that schism, that kind of cleavage between the neoconservatism represented by Douglas Murray and their kind of, whatever you want to call it, neolibertarian right-wing views is an interesting one to watch.
Interesting. I mean, I'm tempted to side, well, I mean, obviously on Israel-Palestine, I'm siding with Joe Rogan there over Douglas Murray, who is probably one of the most sort of revolting characters around. Before we get carried away with standing Joe Rogan, though, The New Republic has published a new piece referencing him today. It's by Kate Aronoff. So it has the title, Climate Change Has a Joe Rogan Problem. The subheading, large numbers of people currently get their information from non-traditional media sources. The information they're getting about climate change isn't very good, Kate Aronoff writes. An analysis published this week by Yale Climate Connections found that 8 of the 10 most popular online shows, including those hosted by Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, have spread false or misleading information about climate change. A report from the British news site Tortoise Media, analysing the climate-related output of more than 300 influencers, likewise shows that climate skeptic posts on YouTube grew by 43% between 2021 and 2024. On X, such content ballooned by 82% over the same time period. As much as 40% of it posits that climate change is merely an excuse for some shadowy network of conspirators to control the population and or bring about communism. I think in a way this is a bit of a sort of a stop clock is right twice a day, because I mean, I'm not an avid listener of Joe Rogan, but my understanding is sort of the people who do really well on them are the people who say that the main narrative you're given is false, and something completely different is going on. And obviously when that's, about Israel and Palestine, you end up kind of at the right conclusion. Like the main narrative you are sold on Israel-Palestine is false, but then they also use the same argument when it comes to climate change, when it comes to COVID, when it comes to vaccines. And I don't actually think that probably Joe Rogan is a particularly good way of forming one's opinions. Even if on this one, they are in a better position than Douglas Murray. Let's wrap up. Thank you for joining me so much, Kieran. Always a pleasure having you on.
I agree with you about Joe Rogan. Thank you for having me on, Michael. Cheers.
Thank you everyone for watching and tuning in. Come back on tomorrow, whatever day that is, Thursday, I suppose, for another live show from 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.